Hello everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and today we begin an episode on Hesiod in order to lead us into Homer and the rest of Greek literature. In fact, in order to understand Homer, and in order to understand the whole of Greek literature and even Greek philosophy, beginning with Plato, we must begin with the poet Hesiod. The story goes that Hesiod and Homer were bitter rivals, and that Hesiod won first place in a poetry contest against the great blind poet of the two defining epics of Western literature. Hesiod's surviving works, the Theogony and the Works and Days, are much easier reads than Homer's two monumental epics. Perhaps the brevity of his works allow for people to give Hesiod sole credit, but the breadth and scope of Homer's work demand collective credit, even though other authors have individually produced monumental works as long or longer than Homer's two masterpieces. And for anyone who would like a more traditional and very convincing defense of Homeric authorship, I suggest you look at M.L. West. There remains a long-standing dispute over whether Hesiod's poems were written before or after Homer. In the La Scienza Nueva, Giambattista Vico, who lived and wrote in the early 1700s, convincingly explained, in my opinion, that the older tradition of poetry is that of sublime violence, even if Vico's own reading of Homer is often wanting at best. Vico famously said that Homer was primitive and couldn't possibly had written the Iliad and the Odyssey. And in fact, Vico's reflections on Homeric authorship give birth to the more common tradition that is familiar to us today, where collective credit is given to the Iliad and the Odyssey. Nevertheless, Vico's axiomatic foundation of sublime sex and violence always being the older tradition in poetry is very relevant to us. And since I regard it as fundamentally true, it is clear that Hesiod's content, irrespective of whether he wrote before or after Homer, is the older tradition of poetry. In short, Hesiod is dealing and defending an older tradition of sublime Greek poetry. Anyone who has read the Theogony knows that blood, lust, and violence run replete through its pages, at a degree, I might add, far greater than Homer, and especially since Hesiod's poem celebrates violence, while Homer's epic, as we will eventually see in our episodes covering Homer's great works, subtly rebuke it. Moreover, Hesiod's poem is about the gods, and Homer's poem is about mortal men, even if gods feature prominently in it. The writings of Hesiod and Homer are, and it's important to understand it here, cosmogonic poems. They are, therefore, works of poetic metaphysics, as Vico says. The Hesiodic cosmos is entirely about the gods. Human actors do not appear, apart from the authorial voice asking the muses to sing praises to the violent gods of the cosmos, who castrated their father and participated in patricidal usurpation to reign supreme over the stars. When the poem ends with the mentioning of Achilles, Odysseus, and Aeneas, it is just offhand. None of the human characters are actors and movers of the poem. The prime movers of Hesiod's poems are the gods, and it is Zeus in particular who wins the adoration of Hesiod and the muses. The Hesiodic cosmos is erotic and violent. It is a strife-filled universe. Hesiod's poem opens infamously with "Muses of Helicon, let us begin our song with them who hold the great and holy mountain of Helicon, and around its violet-like spring an altar of exceedingly strong Kronos dance on dainty feet, and who, after bathing their soft skin in the Permosis or the spring of the horse or holy Olmios on the peak of Helicon, form their dances, beautiful dances that arouse desire, and they move erotically. The erotic overtures in the opening of the poem should be evident enough, and the erotic overtures also prefigures the violence to come. There are two lines of gods in the Theogony. The first line of gods is pre-existent. The primordial deities are the first gods we are introduced to. Some are named and others are not. The two most important for us are Gaia, Mother Earth, and Uranus, Father Sky. These gods, most importantly, are not the product of violence or sex, though they do have sexual desires. The second line of gods, which includes the Titans and the Olympians that we are more familiar with, along with the other monsters of Greek mythological lore, are the product of violence and sex, and often violent sex, since the two are intertwined together in Hesiod's poem. Hesiod details for us how Uranus came across the wide bosom of Gaia, and their marital union stemmed from Uranus's uncontrollable lust. Uranus preys upon Gaia and engages in predatory sex, which injures the mother goddess and results in the birth of the Titans. Worried that his children will hate him and usurp his authoritarian power, Uranus seals up the Titans deep in Gaia's fertile womb, which causes her much pain. As the Titans grow and move about, Gaia's tummy expands and causes her to moan and scream in pain, which also evokes the erotic overtures that the poem began with. The birth of reason in the Hesiodic cosmos is through hatred. Reason is the product of resentment and the desire to harm. Cunning Gaia, we are told, fashions a sickle out of the materials of the earth and implores one of her children to attack Uranus and bring forth their collective liberation. Kronos is the only Titan willing to take up this challenge. Kronos seizes the sickle, not out of love for Gaia, we might point out here, but out of hatred for his father. He then ambushes the Sky Father God in an act of patricidal usurpation that gives birth to the rest of the world and the Olympian deities, as Hesiod poetically describes it. Great Uranus came, bringing the night, and spread out around Gaia, desiring Philiotes, and was extended. His son reached out from ambush with his left hand, and in his right he held the sickle, long and serrated, and the genitals of his father he quickly reaped and threw behind his back to be carried away. But they did not flee from his hand fruitlessly, as many drops of blood spurted forth. All of them Gaia received. The blood that spurted forth from Uranus's castration, falling onto Gaia's fertile body, gave birth to the monsters and the furies of mythological fame. More graphically, however, is how this act of sexual violence and patricidal usurpation birthed the Olympian deities and sets the stage for the Titanochemy and the overthrow of the Titans by the Olympian deities, eventually led by Zeus. Hesiod writes in this most sublime moment of the poem, "As soon as Kronos lopped off the genitals with the sickle, they fell from the mainland into the much surging sea, so that the sea carried them for a long time. Around them a white foam from the immortal skin began to arise. In it a maiden was nurtured. First she drew near holy Cythera, and from there she arrived at Kypros, or Cyprus, surrounded by water. From within, a majestic and beautiful goddess, steeped, and all around grass grew beneath her slender feet. Aphrodite, foam-born goddess, and fair-wreathed Cytherea, gods and men call her because she was nurtured in white foam. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Those gods born of lust and violence have the spirit of lust and violence coursing through their veins. Kronos is as equally vindictive as his father Uranus. Terrified by the prospects of losing his power, he eats his children to preserve his power and authority. Just as Kronos alone rose to challenge his tyrannical father, so it is that Zeus is the only Olympian to rise and challenge his tyrannical father. Zeus rallies the Olympians and launches the great war of the gods, the war of the Titans and the Olympians. Thunder and lightning reign over the earth, and the drums of war and violence sound forth to break the trees, hills, and mountains. The heavy pounding of their feet reached murky Tartarus, as did the shrill screams of the terrible pursuit and powerful missiles. Thus they hurled mournful darts at one another. The sound of both reached starry Uranus as they cried out. They clashed with a great war cry, Hesiod informs us. After defeating the Titans, Zeus then slays the ferocious serpentine monster Typhoeus to solidify his place as the supreme god of the pantheon. Hesiod's cosmos is one governed by violence, sexual lust, and strife. The agon is fundamental to the Hesiodic cosmos. The Hesiodic cosmos is governed by chaotic violence. And in the Theogony, we also see what 18th and 19th century German philosophers and scholars eventually coined as the Chaos Kampf, the chaos war or the chaos struggle. There is, as the poem concludes, no hope in the Hesiodic cosmos of strife, violence, and war. And this hopelessness to the Hesiodic cosmos is what differentiates it from the Homeric cosmos, which we will focus on in future episodes. The muses sing of the gods who are strong enough and willing enough to overthrow their parents and seize power for themselves. It is an unadulterated celebration of lust, sex, and war. The weaker gods who sat back, terrified of the prospects of engaging in bloodshed, are the gods whom the muses brush aside and forget. They do not sing praises to those gods. And if you recall, in reading the Theogony, the two chief gods that are sung, or at least referenced, by the muses are Kronos, because he challenged Uranus and castrated him, and Zeus, because Zeus ultimately, through his patricidal usurpation and war, became the chief deity of the pantheon. Hesiod's Theogony is ultimately a praise poem to Zeus, but it is also, to a lesser extent, as we've just said, a praise poem to Kronos, the other god who warred with his father and set in motion the movement and the chain of events to Zeus's triumph over the whole of the cosmos. In Hesiod's cosmos, we see the triumph of hatred, resentment, and strife. Furthermore, the Theogony is a heroic poem. It sings of the heroic deeds of Zeus. But what are the heroic deeds of Zeus celebrated by the muses and the poet? Answering this question is going to be important for our dialectical contrast between Hesiod and Homer, since both are heroic poems, but again, as we shall see when we explore Homer's two epics, his heroic deeds that he sings about aren't the militaristic and violent deeds that are sung about in the Theogony, even though it superficially seems as if that is what the muses are singing about on one's first reading of the Iliad. The deeds worthy of praise in the Theogony are militant deeds of conquest and violent usurpation. Zeus, and ultimately Zeus alone in the end, is worthy of praise for his courage in rebelling and defeating his father and slaying the most vicious monster of Greek mythological lore, Typhoeus. In slaying gods and beasts, Zeus sets the heroic archetype we are familiar with in the rest of Greek mythology and even medieval mythology. The hero killing monsters and vindictive supernatural entities. This bleak and conflictual worldview is not just contained in epic heroic poetry. The histories of Herodotus begin with the agonistic portrait of the world reminiscent of Hesiod. Herodotus quickly discusses the Persian account of the abduction of Io to Egypt, the Greek abduction and rape of Europa, then the story of Paris's abduction and rape of Helen, which sparked the Trojan War. Throughout the histories, we witness, with Herodotus, cycles of violence leading to vengeance or retributive justice, egoistic power and pride ending in destruction. This cycle then renews itself individually and collectively over the course of the work. While Herodotus rationalizes the mythological stories wherein human actors, rather than capricious gods, are responsible for these crimes, Herodotus's cosmos is still one of sublime violence, just as much as the Hesiodic cosmos is. Befitting the rationalizing tendency of Herodotus and the later Greek philosophical and historical tradition, the answer to the problem of human violence is the honoring of law. Homer, however, offers us something far greater, more powerful, and more moving than the historians and the philosophers do. And in order to understand the great revolution that Homer begins, we must know this cursory, basic information about Hesiod's Theogony. If there is one thing to remember about the Hesiodic cosmos, portrayed and sung to us by the muses in the Theogony, is that it is a poem, a cosmos of absolute violence, of lust, sex, and war, of agonistic strife. And only the gods who are willing to engage in the thrill of combat, the thrill of sexual lust and violence, are worthy to be sung of as heroes. And as we shall see, that tradition is completely upended in the works of Homer